Good. I call Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Labour Party opposes the Education Freedom of Association Amendment Bill on the grounds that it will destroy students' associations. It will destroy the representation, advocacy and services that tertiary students have received from student associations for many years, and as a result it will undermine the educational success and campus experience of many students. It's interesting to me, Mr Speaker, that in her opening remarks Heather Roy decided to congratulate and thank the various members of the Young ACT Party and National. Kind of really indicates where ACT is coming from on this bill. It's ideological. It's a straight-out ideological decision that they're making. It's actually a tribute to the success of student associations over the years on issues like fees and loans and allowances that those on the right of the political spectrum or the far right of the political spectrum are so threatened that they'll come back to this Parliament time and again to try and go and ruin those student associations. But, Mr Speaker, it's to the national members of this House that I want to address my remarks now. Because the national members of this House, many of them perhaps share some of those ideological views, but many of them don't, Mr Speaker. And many of the members of the National Party who sat through the submissions, I know, were looking at this from a practical point of view. They were looking at this from what this actually meant for the experience of students on campus. And anyone who sat through the submission process cannot have failed to realise the impact that this bill will have on the practical experience of students. We can take it from the individual case of the student from Hamilton who lived in a flat which burned down, and their insurance company was going to do nothing to help them. Their insurance company was taking them to the cleaners, the insurance company of the person who owned the flat. It was the intervention of the Waikato Students' Union that enabled that student and his flatmates to continue being students at university. This student who showed up and spoke to us via video conference at the Select Committee made it clear that he wasn't a particularly ideological person. He was just a normal student. I think he was a science student, actually, and he said most of his mates, most of his friends had very little idea about the value of the student union until that day. But after that day, they knew the value of the student union because the student union at Waikato University made sure they could carry on studying. That's the kind of advocacy, that's the kind of representation that this bill will kill off. But you can take it at a much higher level. The tertiary institutions who came to the Select Committee, and all bar one, I think, said, please do not pass this bill. These are the Vice-Chancellors, these are the Chief Executives of the Polytech and the Wānanga who came to the Select Committee and said, we value what student associations do on our campuses. We value the services they provide, we value the representative function that they provide, we value the advocacy they provide. If the Parliament passes this bill, these tertiary institutions told us that will fundamentally undermine that campus experience and that role on campus. And those tertiary institutions are not great ideological radicals. They're people who are thinking about what practically works on their campus. And if it means talking about dollars and cents to convince the National Party, well, we had that too. Because the tertiary institutions know there's no way they can provide the services, they can provide the representation or the advocacy as cost effectively as student associations do. There was an excellent submission from NZUSA drawing on work from PricewaterhouseCoopers that was able to show the dollar values that free student labour via student associations and the cost effectiveness of student association work, what that actually means. And the tertiary institutions, under a funding squeeze from this government, are looking at this and saying, we will not be able to provide these services. These tertiary institutions who know the value of student associations are saying to the National Party, do not pass this bill. But that practical outcomes, those practical implications, seem to sail right over the head of the National Party members, except that they didn't. They knew. They knew that people had come to the Select Committee with ideas to improve the current law. And let's remember, Mr Speaker, we're not standing here tonight debating a bill that's going to amend a Labour Party law. We're debating a bill that's going to amend a National Party law. This was a law the National Party passed, and it put in place a very good accountability mechanism, that if students wanted to, they could have a referendum. They could have a referendum if they could get 10% of students to agree about whether an association would be universal or compulsory or voluntary. And so that choice for students is in a law that the National Party passed. And then tonight we come here and the National Party is supporting taking away that choice, overriding their own law because of the ACT Party's ideological commitments. Not because of the practicalities of what's good for students, not because of what tertiary institutions are saying to this Parliament they want, but because they are going to support the ideological views of students. Mr. Speaker, student associations have been part of some of the main innovations on campuses in recent years. Going back 20, 30, 40 years, student job search, the university game, watching the Commonwealth Games, seeing people cycling around the track who owe the fact that they've got there to their involvement in university sport, supported by student associations. Student newspapers and radio, student health and counselling services only on campuses because student associations have been there. Hardship funds, subsidised bus transport, bookshops, you name it. Student associations have been at the core of creating those services on campus. And tertiary institutions know they can't do it. Now, at universities, Mr. Speaker, it may well be that student associations will survive, and we've seen, obviously, in Auckland University that they can survive. But what form do they survive in, Mr. Speaker? They survive in the form that the tertiary institutions are prepared to put up with. They don't survive in the form where students control student affairs. That's what happens now. But then, now, it'll be up to the tertiary institution. In the 1990s, and I would remind Heather Roy that in 1994, I think, Michael Laws brought a bill to this Parliament to try and make student association voluntary. Earlier on, you said it was the year 2000 that you first noticed it. What Michael Laws's bill founded, and one of the reasons was a strong campaign that said things like, do you want the Vice-Chancellor to choose the music for orientation? That's the choice. Do you want to hand over all of the student services to those tertiary institutions? That's at the universities where they might survive. Mr. Speaker, the students at polytechnics who don't have the infrastructure, don't have the funding at an institutional level to keep these services going, that's where the students will suffer. Those Polytech Students Associations won't be able to get themselves going. It is a bizarre belief that in passing this bill, suddenly student associations will simply be able to carry on as they were, recruiting members, everything will be fine. Students facing high fees at the start of a year, we don't even know under this bill if they'd be able to use the student loan scheme to actually pay for the student association fees. Those students will be put off from enrolling, and then once they're put off from enrolling in that first year, it'll be very hard to get them in the future, Mr. Speaker. If we look across the Tasman, when the equivalent of this legislation went through, 72% of student associations had near total or total cuts to services once this bill went through, once the equivalent of this bill went through. We know what will happen to student associations if this bill passes through, Mr. Speaker. What really disturbs me, Mr. Speaker, was there was opportunity in this process for change to be made. There were good submissions that suggested, for instance, tidying up the question around objection or conscientious objection, looking at better accountability mechanisms. They are the issues that Heather Roy raised in her speech. Why didn't the National Party members pick those ideas up? They were on the table. We heard in the Select Committee some excellent submissions from people who said, I want student associations to survive, not for an ideological reason, but for the practical benefits that they provide. And the National Party decided not to pick those up. And that is a great shame, Mr. Speaker, because it means that they have simply brought in to the ideological ideas of the ACT Party. Mr. Speaker, the Labor Party has already said in the Minority Report that if we return to government, we will repeal this legislation. We still have a chance, Mr. Speaker, in this debate to be able to stop this bill and even to stop the worst effects of this bill. We have a committee stage where there will be amendments, and the National Party members who sat through the Select Committee process, who heard about the value of students' associations to individual students and to tertiary institutions, have the opportunity in the Committee of the Whole House process to adopt some of those changes so that student associations can continue to provide the support, the advocacy, the representation and the services that have made a fundamental difference to the lives of students for well over 100 years in many cases. And Mr. Speaker, this is not just about universities. This is about polytechnics. This is about people who come into tertiary education perhaps without the awareness of everything that's going to happen to them. They become part of a community.